Good morning. So uplifting to worship together this morning. It's been a rich day, refocusing, uplifting. I too want to thank Rob. You did a great job this morning. So inspiring to hear not only what you are doing, but what the Lord is doing in Slovakia and Ukraine. Pretty inspiring. And church, you inspire me every year at VBS time. I've always been impressed with the participation of this church, just hardworking. And it really shows at VBS, all of you who have done decorating and planning, and those who are getting ready to teach and help in all kinds of ways. I just want to, I love it, so encouraged by it. I just want to remind you it matters. In the big scheme of things, it matters a great deal. We're going to continue this morning thinking about this 3 John, shortest letter in the New Testament. We're following 3 named men in this letter. So last week we looked at the first 8 verses that deals with Gaius, and John is encouraging his dear friend Gaius. Today we're going to look at verses 9 and 10, where he is calling out a bad apple. And I'm using this big, ugly word, narcissist, today. Narcissist does not show up in our text, but it's the word we use commonly in our world today to describe the type of person that we're presented with in this portion of the letter. It is a person who is full of themselves, who has this air of superiority, who is overbearing, the kind of person who might use power and position for personal gain, sometimes in abusive ways. So when we talk about narcissism, we're not just talking about a bad attitude, but a bad apple. It's, the saying, the bad old apple spoils the barrel. In other words, this kind of behavior affects the larger body. This kind of behavior in a member affects the whole church. And so we have to pay attention to it. It needs to be addressed. So this text leads us to some uncomfortable, but I believe necessary reflections on the ugly realities that very often plague the church. So, verses 9 and 10, the 3rd letter of John. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. And he says that just following his encouragement to Gaius to keep on welcoming the brothers, keep on welcoming these traveling missionaries. I don't know if you recognize this guy. His name's Andreas Deja. Probably not saying that right. He's a character animator. There's a few of the characters there, if you can see those, that he is the supervising animator for those well-known figures. The first villain that he was charged to animate was from Beauty and the Beast, Gaston. If you remember him, you see him up there in the upper corner. Here's a better picture of him there. And I didn't ever think about this, but the challenge that this animator had, he was presented with the task to create a handsome villain. That's interesting. A handsome villain. And the reason was because the story of Beauty and the Beast is pointing out that outward appearances don't tell you the truth about what's going on the inside. So we need to see somebody who at first is attractive, but then we see the villain come out. He is the classic narcissist. Conceited, full of himself, rude, even bully-like. He gradually grows more sinister throughout the story. I thought it was interesting that when this guy was tasked to create a handsome villain, he went to Los Angeles and observed the residents as they were looking in the mirror and fixing their hair and adjusting, and that was his inspiration. I thought that, because you see narcissism everywhere. It's among us. And this text is teaching us it's more serious than we might think. John sketches a Diotrephes as a Gaston-type figure. And he's addressing him because it's more harmful than he appears. He is egotistical. We're going to look at some ugly words today. Egotistical. It's all about me, what I can do, what I think, what I like, what I want. Look at verse 9 there. It says, I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So John is addressing a serious church problem. There is this influential figure who is stopping the support of these missionaries from John's congregation. We saw this morning in class of how important networking among churches is even today. In their world, this is crucial, this networking between churches, bringing teaching to the different house churches and then out into the larger world. And now you've got a guy using his influence to put the brakes on that. It is a serious church problem. He says that he had written something earlier to the church. We don't know exactly what that was. It could be 1st or 2nd John that he's referring to. There is a case to be made for that. I think it's more likely that there's another letter where he's more directly encouraging hospitality to these missionaries. And that letter is probably lost to us, probably because Diotrephes would have nothing to do with it. He didn't save the letter like Gaius and other believers did ever since then. Diotrephes refuses this instruction from the elder. He does not receive John. He does not receive his authority. The church, the brothers that John is sending, he does not welcome them. And John puts his finger on the root problem. It's an ego problem. He likes to put himself first. Really fascinating in my study, I came across just looking at the name Diotrephes. And I don't know about this, it was just curious to me. His name means born of God, or in the Greek world, it'd be born of Zeus. And when you trace where that name shows up, it's usually in Greek aristocracy. And so just by his name, we get the idea that he was probably born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's known wealth and privilege and entitlement his whole life. And you see it reflected in this kind of superior type mindset. He has an ego problem, and John says that's the problem. Ego problems become church problems. One author that I looked at studying, he said personal ego issues are at the root of most dissension in the church today. And it gave me a lot of pause. Where do we see dissension in the church today? Can you trace it back? Largely to ego problems, to selfish ambition, to putting myself first, to what I want. It's almost a joke today to talk about churches arguing and dividing over the color of the carpet. Because it's when we start doing new building initiatives that we start having an opinion on everything, including the color of the carpet and what comes out, what I think, what I want, what I like. It is so often the case that when a church builds a new building, dissension surfaces because of ego. It's a good reminder to us as we're getting ready to build a new building that we check ourselves at this ego level. I don't know about you, but I tend to think other people have an ego problem. I had a friend who visited a former place where I was a former employee. He spoke with my old boss and made the connection that he knew me. And my old boss was complimentary of me in lots of ways, but he had to get this one negative in. And he said, let me tell you something about David. David has always got to be right. And my friend brought that back to me, and I went, he's right. And I don't mean that sarcastically. It really gave me pause. And I recognized I know what he's talking about. I see that in myself, that I think my way is right, and I insist on it. As we're reading this, it's so important that we resist pinning Diotrephes labels on other people. That we resist thinking, oh yeah, I know someone that's got an ego problem. We go, no, what if I'm that guy? What if I'm the guy that's got the ego problem that's more harmful and disruptive than I might think? Philippians chapter 2, Paul's writing to a church that has experienced some level of dissension, and he addresses the ego. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. the mind of Christ, the attitude of Christ, is such a contrast with the attitude of Diotrephes. Let's follow the model of Christ. Humble, thinking about other people, not putting our ego first. Okay, second ugly word, malicious. Having or showing the desire to harm someone. Notice verse 10. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. Now, why is he doing it? Because he likes to put himself first. We've already seen the motive. What is he doing? We get the first part of it right here. He is talking wicked nonsense against us. The NIV, I believe, says spreading malicious nonsense about us. It's combining two things, saying something that's false and something that's wicked, something that's evil, something that's malicious. There's a desire to do harm by tearing down a reputation, by saying something that is not true. It's got to damage the reputation of the elder, of John. I think it's a way of undermining his authority because Diotrephes likes whatever position of influence he is, and he perceives John as somewhat of a rival or a threat. So by taking John down a notch, he shores up his own superiority. That is a standard bully behavior. You beat someone else down, you give them a black eye, whether that's physically or their reputation. You give them a black eye, a ruined reputation to secure your own position of strength or superiority. And again, we got to say, am I that guy? Because I want to think the bully is always somebody else. But what if I've got a little bit of bully behavior in me? I've mentioned before this book by Jerry Bridges, Respectable Sins, Confronting the Sins We Tolerate. Just a fascinating idea. He's not the only one that has thought of this, but it's where it first struck me. When he writes about socially acceptable sins as opposed to serious sins. Looking at our tendency to say, well, there are some sins that are really bad, that are really ugly, and there are those that we just sort of tolerate. We could call them refined sins. These are the sins of nice people, sins that we can regularly commit and still retain our positions as elders, deacons, Sunday school teachers, and Bible study leaders. They deceive us into thinking they are not so bad, or not thinking of them as sins, or even worse, not even thinking about them at all. He gets us to think maybe the things that I don't think are a big deal are actually a big deal. What if the thing that I think of as almost a refined sin, it's respectable, is actually bully behavior? One of those big ones is gossip. Gossip is malignant. You might look at what's happening in this text, and you might say, well, it's more specifically slander. I don't think you can separate too much gossip and slander. They are both they're the same kind of ugliness. It's an ugly growth that spreads through the body, destroying unity, fellowship, and mission. Behind somebody's back, I say something about them, tears them down, gives them a black eye. And maybe I get something out of it. Maybe I get the sense that I'm in the know. Or maybe by comparison, I look a little bit better. I don't know what the personal gain is. I think there's some ego in it. But what I want to point out is gossip is one of those things that sometimes we just think, oh yeah, everybody kind of gossips. Sometimes we even have a little fun. We get some enjoyment out of it. It is malignant. It destroys fellowship. Ephesians 4, Paul talks about corrupting talk. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths. When I first, as a kid growing up, I thought that was like, saying bad words, which is not good. Don't say bad words. Your words ought to do something good. But no corrupting talk. I like how one translator put this, let no diseased word journey from your mouth. Don't let anything come out of your mouth that's got this malignancy, this disease that destroys people, that tears people down. Instead, it ought to build up. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up. It doesn't mean it always feels good. It just means it's constructive. It does good. It builds up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Boy, our words ought to be vehicles of grace, far more than vehicles of that malignant gossip that tears people down and destroys community. Let's give grace to each other. Third ugly word, domineering. Overbearing, controlling, determined to enforce one's will. Look at the middle of second half of verse 10. And not content with that, not content to spread this malicious nonsense, he refuses to welcome the brothers. Okay, that's deliberate defiance. In refusing hospitality, it's deliberate defiance to the elder. Remember verse 9, he does not acknowledge our authority. He's asserting his own will by refusing to do what the elder has charged them to do. And goes further, and also stops those who want to do what the elder said, he's going to put a stop to, and he doesn't stop there. He puts them out of the church. Asserting his own authority, stopping others, even going so far as to put them out of the church. And right here we go, your villain is showing. Okay? This is where you start seeing how destructive this ego-driven behavior is. Now, we don't know what kind of influence he had. He was apparently a leader of some kind. Some would suggest that maybe he's self-appointed. He's just sort of assumed this position of being the boss. Could be that he's got a more official role in leading. Either way, he's driven by what he wants to the point that he would deliberately defy those that he ought to submit to and put a stop to anybody who doesn't want to do what he wants them to do. It is an abuse of power. It's when you misuse your position, you misuse your power, whatever level you have, for personal gain. And you'll do it even to points that are abusive to others. Self-love, that's ego, putting myself first. Self-love often leads to the abuse of power. And we see it all the time in our world. We see people in high positions who use their position to get something they want. We see it in government. We see it in schools. We see it in businesses. We see it in churches. Wherever there's an ego, you're going to see self-love that leads to abusing power and position in ways that do harm, devastating harm sometimes to people. I don't know what kind of position you're in. See, not many of us are in high positions. But I got to think, do I domineer? Am I bossing? Do I got to have control of things? I put in my notes to say, and here I am saying it, do you know a bossy person? Don't look, okay? Don't look around you. Just doing some self-examination, I recognize how often I want people to do what I want them to do. And it's been one of the things in the last 10 or so years that I feel like God's really been working on in me, is to let go of some of that. Because it's a huge burden to carry, and it usually does not amount to anything good to assert what I think needs to happen. This impulse to control, I think we feel it all the time. No doubt you experience some level of it in whatever role you have in life, a desire to, I want to do this, I want people to do it my way. It's not good, and it's more harmful than you realize. It's not the way of Jesus. The way of serving Christ is not bossing. It's not domineering. It's not exerting your will on others. It's just the opposite of that. Think about the way Jesus taught about authority. Mark chapter 10, verse 42 through 45. And Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them." That's domineering. "And their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The model of Jesus is selflessness. Not self-love, it's selfless love. It's serving love. It's putting other people first. That's very different than this domineering, controlling kind of authority. Authority comes with responsibility to say, I'm going to do what's in their best interest, even at great sacrifice to myself. That's the way you go about serving Christ. What's ironic about this teaching is it came in a very moment when John himself was having a little Diotrephes moment. He was kind of having a little ego moment where he's wanting to be great. And Jesus says, no, John, let's talk about great. You want to be great? You go be a servant. John has learned this lesson from Jesus. And now he's approaching a guy with an ego and he's calling him out. And I just want to think about that for a minute because we've looked at the villain, but think about the elder here. The elder is calling this guy out. Notice verse 10 again. I kind of went by this pretty quick. So if I come, now if there's some translations will put when. That's not saying, hey, I'm kind of thinking about maybe coming, possibly coming. This generally means when I come. This is my intent to come. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and he goes on. John writes a letter before he can even visit. He said, this has got to be dealt with. So he writes the letter and he calls him out and he says, and then when I come, I'm going to call even more attention to this. Sometimes that's necessary. Now, my approach today has been to say, I think most of us, and most of the time, we need to read things like this and say, am I Diotrephes? Do I have an ego problem? Am I malicious? Am I domineering? I think we do a lot more good to think about how we're doing that than to point fingers and pin it on somebody else. But at the same time, I don't want to underappreciate or underemphasize the necessity of calling this kind of behavior out. It can't just be swept under the rug, and I think that largely falls on our leaders, on elders, our shepherds. They sometimes have the necessary job of calling attention to something that is truly devastating to people and to the church. It hinders the health and the work of the church, and you can't let that thing just go. Chuck DeGroat's got a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church, and he has this thought that helped me in here. I thought of this as I was looking at John in this text. Chuck writes, I'm disheartened when a theology of grace is misappropriated by those who've abused power, manipulated the truth, and exploited the powerless. And he's talking about people that are in those high positions that have abused the position to do devastating harm to other people, and then they say things like, we all need grace. Well, yes, we all need grace, but if you're in that position, you cannot behave like that. And sometimes it's got to be publicly addressed. He says, grace never whitewashes abuse. Grace exposes the abuser, not to shame him for the sake of truth, not to shame him, but for the sake of truth and healing for all. Now, again, I think for the most part, we need to be recognizing, hey, where am I being like that? Where do I have things I need to work on? But sometimes there is a place to necessarily expose for the health of the church this kind of really destructive, narcissistic behavior. John is exposing an abuse that is necessary for the health of the church. And I think necessary for Diotrephes too. Have you ever wondered how this meeting went? How did this meeting go? When John goes and visits him, and he's going to call even more attention to what he's doing, we don't know how it went. So I don't want to speculate, but I'll just say I know who John learned from. And all I can say is I know this about Jesus. I know that Jesus calls out bad apples. John learned it from him. Jesus has extremely hard rebukes for Pharisees. People who have a position and responsibility to lead, and they have misused and even abused that position. He has really hard words for them. It's also a Pharisee who wrote a large part of the New Testament, who he transformed and commissioned to reach the world with the gospel. Oh, he has grace for Diotrephes, guys. Jesus calls out bad apples. He also changes and commissions them. I don't know what happened to Diotrephes. I don't know what he did. But I know that when Jesus calls us out and we recognize that's an ugly thing in me, that is not a final verdict. It is not condemnation. It's bringing you to your attention something that needs to change, that he has the power to change, and that he can transform. I almost didn't want to use the word narcissist today because sometimes people think about that as the permanent label. I read one time, you can Google, can a narcissist change? Everybody's asking it. And a lot of people will say, nope, a narc is a narc. No, absolutely not. The Spirit of Jesus transforms people. And if anything today, if you're reading it, you're hearing this and going, yes, some of those ugly words, they fit. You've got to hear the power of the gospel that is so full of grace. It doesn't leave it uncalled out. It calls it out and says this is sick, it's malignant, it's dangerous, it's harmful, but it's not condemnation. There's grace. Grace that transforms and changes you. So if you are aware of some things today that you say, I need to repent. I need to change that. I need to acknowledge this publicly. It might do you some good to voice some of that publicly. We'd love to pray with you and help think about what it looks like going forward for you. If you've never responded to the gospel, you've got to hear, and I'll just say it over and over again, the gospel is not an invitation to people who aren't bad apples. It is an invitation to bad apples. It is for bad apples that Jesus died. He loves you so much. He gave his life for you, that you would come and be washed clean, forgiven, and then transformed. So if you need to respond today and be baptized into Christ, I'd love for you to come to the front while we stand and sing.